Elena stared at the reflection in the polished granite countertop, but she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her left eye was a swollen map of deep purples and angry reds, a rotting plum of a bruise Julian had given her just 8 hours ago. As Julian stood in the doorway, pristine in his surgical scrubs, he didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her. He just said, "Tell your mother you tripped on the stairs again, Elena. You know how clumsy you've been lately." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. And the terrifying part, he almost sounded like he believed it. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The weight of the ice pack felt like a second punishment against her skin as she listened to the rhythmic sound of Julian stirring sugar into his coffee. Julian was a renowned pediatric surgeon. In the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, he was considered the gold standard of men. He saved children's lives by day and hosted charity fundraisers by night. To the world, their marriage was an aspirational dream. But inside the four walls of their custom-built home, the air was thin and heavy. Elena had learned that certain inflections in her voice, or a laugh that lasted too long at a dinner party, had physical consequences. This latest incident had started over something trivial, a misplaced set of keys. Julian hadn't yelled. He never yelled. He simply moved with a terrifying clinical speed. One moment she was reaching for her purse, and the next, her skull was vibrating from the impact of the door frame. The sound of her own bone-striking wood was hollow and dense. Julian had simply stepped over her, adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, and gone to sleep. Now, as the morning sun began to bleed through the high-end shutters, Julian was back in his caring persona. He walked over and gently touched her shoulder. The touch made her stomach churn. "I'm worried about you, Elena," he whispered, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Your coordination is getting worse. I think it's the stress. I've already told your mother that you might need to stay home for a few weeks to rest." Elena said nothing. Silence was the only safety she had left. She watched him walk to the window, looking out at Clover Street. He waved a friendly hand at a neighbor walking their dog. He was a master of the frozen mask, a man who could switch from a predator to a pillar of the community in the blink of an eye. He was actively rewriting her history, turning her into a fragile, unstable woman in the eyes of everyone they knew. This was how it worked. This was gaslighting in marriage. He wasn't just hiding his violence. He was making her the architect of her own ruin. If she told the truth, who would believe her? She was the clumsy wife, and he was the hero doctor. The isolation was nearly complete. She had started to feel small, as if she were disappearing into the beige carpets and expensive lavender scents of a house that offered no protection. Julian checked his watch and kissed her temple. "Rest up. I'll have my mother stop by later to check on you. Don't go outside. You look like you need to sleep." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the garage, his gait confident and unhurried. He left her there in the kitchen, a prisoner in a palace, wrapped in a silence so thick it felt like it would never break. Elena stood up slowly, her muscles stiff and aching. She walked to the window to watch his car pull out of the driveway. As she looked out, she didn't see Julian's car. Instead, her eyes locked onto something else. Across the street, nestled under the corner of Mrs. Gable's porch roof, was a brand new security camera. Its small red indicator light was steady, blinking, and patient, staring directly at the spot where the morning light hit their bedroom window. Julian hadn't noticed it yet, but that red eye had been watching all night. Mrs. Gable had lived on Clover Street since 1987. At 74, she was built like a woman who had never backed down from a single thing in her life. Every morning she sat on her porch with a mug of Folgers and a quality of attention that could only be described as professional. She noticed everything: who left early, who came home late, and whose porch light stayed off when it was usually on. Her late husband always joked that she should have been a detective. After a rash of car break-ins the previous November, her son had installed a brand new security system, 3 wide-angle, motion-activated cameras that were crisp, patient, and uncompromising. From her porch, Mrs. Gable watched Elena walk to the mailbox. She saw the heavy sunglasses Elena wore, even though the sky was overcast. She saw the way Elena held her head at a careful angle, the way people hold things that ache. But more than that, she recognized the posture of habitual caution that Elena had adopted so gradually she no longer noticed it herself. Didn't see a clumsy woman. She saw a woman who was quietly bleeding on the inside while the neighborhood called her husband a saint. The previous night, at 2 a.m., Mrs. Gable had been woken by raised voices coming from across the street. She had stepped onto her porch in her slippers and seen enough through a gap in the blinds to make her press her hand flat against her chest. She went back inside and replayed the side yard footage on her son's tablet. The camera had caught the silhouette of the impact through the window, the sudden drop, the terrible stillness, and then Julian's profile as he unhurriedly left for work the next morning, with his coffee mug in hand. Mrs. Gable sat with the footage for 2 days. She thought about her sister, Vera, who had stayed in a marriage exactly like that for 18 years because no one did a thing. She realized the truth doesn't always need the victim to speak first. Sometimes it just needs one person with the courage to carry it to the right room. She watched Elena from across the street, a young woman disappearing into the architecture of silence Julian had engineered, and she made a choice. She would not be another person who chose not to see. That afternoon, Julian came home with a bouquet of tulips, playing the part of the devoted husband for the neighbors to see. He walked inside and kissed Elena's temple, whispering that his promotion was finalized and they were moving to Chicago in 2 weeks. He told her it was a fresh start, a way to leave her episodes behind. Elena felt the walls closing in, the isolation becoming permanent. Julian was moving her away from the only people who might notice the truth, and he was doing it with a smile that looked like love to everyone else. Later that evening, after Julian had gone into his office to process paperwork, Elena found a small handwritten note tucked into the bottom of her mailbox. It was from Mrs. Gable. The message was short, but it turned a key in a lock Elena hadn't known was there. "I saw what happened on Tuesday," it read. "The red light on my porch roof sees everything, Elena. Come for tea tomorrow at 10 while he's at the hospital." Julian shouted from the hallway that he had already begun packing their bedroom. He looked at Elena with a flat measuring quality in his eyes, his clinical mask firmly back in place. He had no idea that for the first time in 4 years, the silence in the house wasn't for his safety, it was for hers. Julian was busy planning their disappearance, but across the street, a widow was waiting with a Ziploc bag and a truth that would burn his gold standard life to the ground. Elena stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by half-packed cardboard boxes. Julian's promotion to a prestigious hospital in Chicago had appeared out of thin air, a convenient escape disguised as a career milestone. He was moving with clinical efficiency, sorting through their life as if it were a surgical tray. "We need a fresh start, Elena," he said, his voice dropping into that deep strategic tenderness that had once felt like home. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting just above her sternum. To a stranger, it looked like a supportive embrace. To Elena, it felt like the iron bars of a cage clicking into place. She remembered the first time he used that voice. It was at a medical fundraiser 3 years ago, a night of champagne and forced smiles. Julian had approached her mother, Diane, before he ever spoke to her. He had kissed Diane's hand, called her ma'am, and promised he would take care of her youngest daughter as if she were porcelain. He had been strategic in his tenderness, winning over her family's defense so expertly that Elena's own instincts were silenced by their applause. He didn't just marry Elena, he secured the social permission to own her. In the present, the packing continued like a countdown. Julian had already begun canceling her commitments. He told her book club she was having episodes of vertigo and informed her mentor at the library that her migraines were becoming neurologically concerning. He was systematically dismantling the architecture of her life, piece by piece, under the guise of being a protective husband. He monitored her laugh, her expressiveness, and her visitors, all while calling it respect for the marriage. The move to Chicago wasn't for a promotion. It was to ensure that when she finally broke, there would be no one nearby to hear the sound. Elena looked down at her hands, which were trembling as she taped a box shut. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone earlier that morning. Diane had sounded relieved that Elena had a doctor in the house to manage her supposed instability. Julian had planted the seeds of doubt so deeply that Elena's own mother was starting to believe the lie of her daughter's fragility over the truth of her son-in-law's temper. Elena realized then that she was being erased. If she didn't find a way to anchor herself to the truth, she would vanish before they even crossed the state line. That afternoon, while Julian was at the hospital finishing his final rounds, Elena walked to the mailbox with her head down, the posture of habitual caution guiding her steps. She expected more bills or change of address forms. Instead, she found a heavy cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside was a simple note in elegant, shaky handwriting that made the air in Elena's lungs turn to ice. It said, "I saw what happened on Tuesday. I have been keeping a ledger for months, baby. Come for tea tomorrow at 10 while he's at the hospital." Elena waited until Julian's luxury sedan cleared the end of the driveway before she moved. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird seeking an exit. She slipped out the back door, staying low and avoiding the line of sight of her own windows. Crossing the street felt like crossing a vast open battlefield. She reached Mrs. Gable's porch, her fingers trembling as she pressed the ringer. The elderly woman opened the door immediately, her eyes sharp and professional, holding a quality of attention that Elena had only ever seen in surgeons like Julian. "Come in, baby," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice a steady anchor. She led Elena into a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and old books. On the table sat a small Ziploc bag containing a black flash drive. Mrs. Gable didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her everything would be okay. Instead, she pushed a tablet across the table and hit play. Elena watched the screen, her breath catching as grainy timestamps began to flicker. There it was, the night of March 4th. The footage was dark but undeniably clear. Elena saw the silhouette through her own bedroom window. She saw the violent shift in the light, the angle of the impact, and then her own body dropping to the floor. The most devastating part wasn't the blow itself. It was watching Julian. On the screen, he stood over her for a full minute, unmoving and clinical. Then he unhurriedly turned on the shower and stepped over her fallen form, as if she were nothing more than a discarded rug. Elena felt a cold, hard certainty settle in her sternum. Seeing the truth from the outside stripped away the last of her excuses. "I have 11 months of this, Elena," Mrs. Gable said, tapping a spiral notebook sitting next to the drive. "I watched my sister stay in a house of mirrors for 18 years, because no one did a thing. I decided I wasn't going to be one of those people who chose not to see." For the first time in 4 years, Elena felt the weight of her secret leave her body and go somewhere it could actually do something. She wasn't just a clumsy wife anymore. She was a woman with irrefutable evidence. As Elena stood to leave, her hand clutching the drive that held her life, a familiar sound echoed through the quiet kitchen. It was the low, rhythmic hum of Julian's engine. She looked through the sheer curtains and froze. Julian's car wasn't continuing to the hospital. It was pulling back into their driveway, and he was looking directly toward Mrs. Gable's front porch with a flat, measuring expression Elena knew all too well. The sound of Julian's engine idling in the driveway felt like a physical weight pressing against Elena's chest. She stayed frozen behind Mrs. Gable's curtains, the black flash drive clutched so tightly in her palm that the plastic edges bit into her skin. Across the street, Julian stepped out of his car, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't walk toward their front door. Instead, he stood by his driver's side door, his eyes narrowed as they swept over the front of Mrs. Gable's house, settling on the very window where Elena stood hiding in the shadows. "Stay still, baby," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He can't see through those shears unless you move." Elena forced herself to breathe, mimic the clinical stillness Julian used before a surgery. She watched as her husband eventually turned away, a thin, tight smile touching his lips before he walked into their house. It wasn't the smile of a man who was satisfied. It was the look of a man who had just confirmed a suspicion. Elena realized then that Julian's concerned doctor persona was more than a mask. It was a surveillance tool. When she finally gathered the courage to slip back home, she found Julian in the kitchen, already making her favorite smothered chicken. He looked up and held her gaze just a few seconds too long. "You were out, Elena. I thought we agreed you needed rest for your balance issues," he said, his tone dripping with fake concern that felt like honey mixed with glass. He reached out to touch the fading bruise on her face, and Elena had to fight the primal urge to recoil. Later that night, the betrayal deepened into something even colder. While Julian showered, Elena checked his gym bag and found a hidden secondary phone tucked into the lining. Her heart hammered as she scrolled through messages from a woman named Chloe, a former nurse from Julian's hospital. They weren't just discussing an affair. They were discussing Elena as if she were a problem to be liquidated. Julian had already transferred $10,000 from their joint savings into an offshore account in Chloe's name. The move to Chicago wasn't a promotion. It was a flight. Julian was fleeing a growing malpractice inquiry at the hospital, and he was planning to use Elena's instability as a cover to strip her of her assets and disappear with his parallel life. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the shower, realizing that the man she had loved for 7 years hadn't just broken her body. He was systematically erasing her existence to fund his next act. She looked at the hidden phone, then at the flash drive she'd hidden in her jewelry box. The clumsy wife was gone. Elena was finally awake, and she realized the storm wasn't coming. She was the storm. Elena didn't go to the police that night. She knew how the world worked for men like Julian. He was a savior of children, a pillar of the community, and she was the woman who tripped on the stairs. If she moved too fast, he would use his medical authority to label her paranoid and delusional, burying the truth under a mountain of psychiatric evaluations. Instead, she sat in the dark of the guest room, staring at the black flash drive. She realized that to reclaim her life, she had to stop being a victim and start being an investigator. She had to document the monster before she could dismantle the mask. The next morning, Elena drove to a small windowless office 3 towns over. She met a man named Elias, a retired detective who specialized in high-asset domestic disputes. She laid out the drive from Mrs. Gable and the photos of Julian's secret phone. "He isn't just hurting you, Elena," Elias said, his voice a gravelly anchor. "He's liquidating you." Elias explained that Julian had been systematically siphoning money from her inheritance for over a year. He was emptying the vault before he burned the building down. The move to Chicago was the final step, a way to isolate her so completely that she would become a mere footnote in his new life with Chloe. Elena felt a wave of nausea, but she didn't crumble. She thought about Mrs. Gable, who had watched her sister suffer for 18 years because no one spoke up. She thought about her own dignity, a thing Julian had tried to treat like a surgical waste. "How do we catch him?" she asked, her voice gaining a sharp, cold focus. "We don't catch him yet. We let him think he's already won." He gave her a small device to clone Julian's phone data and told her to keep performing the role of the foggy wife. Acting was the hardest part, but it was the only way to ensure her survival. When she returned home, Julian was waiting with a special protein shake he'd blended himself. He watched her with an impatient glint in his eyes, a predator waiting for the clock to strike midnight. "Drink up, honey," he whispered. "You've been so stressed. You need the rest." Elena brought the cup to her lips, pretending to take a long sip, while Julian smoothed back her hair with a tenderness that made her skin crawl. She realized then that every loving gesture was just him checking if the policy was still active. She managed to switch the cup for a glass of water when he turned to check a notification. An hour later, Julian was slumped to the sofa, snoring a heavy, unnatural sound. Elena stood over him, the cloner in her hand, her heart a hammer against her ribs. She ran to his office, her hands shaking as she plugged the device into his computer. 10%, 20%. The progress bar moved with agonizing slowness. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number that made her blood turn to ice. "Elena, I'm at the docks. We just intercepted a shipment of your father's vintage watches." Julian didn't sign the export papers. Chloe did. Just as she read the message, she heard the front door lock click open. Julian's mother, Evelyn, walked into the house without knocking, her eyes scanning the dark hallway like a vulture. Elena realized then that Julian wasn't working alone. Betrayal was a family business, and the matriarch had arrived to see why the house was so quiet. Evelyn walked into the kitchen with a proprietary air, her designer heels clicking sharply against the tile. Julian hadn't yet finished packing. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply looked at Elena with eyes that had always treated her like a budget brand shoe forced upon her son. Julian tells me you're still struggling, dear," she said, her voice like honey mixed with glass. She placed a homemade lasagna on the counter, her eyes darting around the room to assess the progress of their forced relocation. Elena realized then that Julian didn't get his cunning nature from a medical textbook. It was a family inheritance. "It's so tragic," Evelyn continued, smoothing an invisible wrinkle in her cream suit. "Your father's death really took a toll on your mind. Maybe it's best if you just let Julian handle the estate paperwork before you move." She leaned in, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "You wouldn't want to make a mistake and lose everything to the government, would you?" Elena took a breath, feeling the cold weight of the flash drive in her pocket. She understood now that this wasn't just Julian's plan to hide his malpractice. It was a family business aimed at liquidating her legacy. Elena forced a vacant, lost expression onto her face, the foggy wife performance she had been perfecting for weeks. "You're right, Evelyn," she whispered, looking her mother-in-law dead in the eye while pretending to trip over the corner of the rug. "I don't know what I'd do without Julian. He's such a dedicated husband." She watched Evelyn's face transform into a mask of smug satisfaction, the look of a predator who thinks the prey has finally stopped running. Julian stirred on the sofa, beginning to groan as the sedative in his system started to wear thin. "I'll head upstairs," Elena said, her voice small and suggestible. "I feel so heavy tonight." She retreated to the bedroom, but she didn't sleep. She put on her headphones and opened the encrypted link Elias had sent to her laptop. The messages from Julian's secret phone were flooding in, and they weren't just from Chloe. "Is she under yet?" A message from Evelyn read? Yeah. Swallowed every drop Julian had replied earlier that day. Good. The lawyer says if the specialist signs the incompetency papers by Tuesday, we can list the lake house by Friday. The lake house was where Elena's childhood lived, and they were planning to sell it off like scrap metal to fund Julian's flight to Chicago. Elena sat in the dark, the glow of the screen the only light in the room, realizing she wasn't just fighting for her money anymore. She was fighting for her life. If she let them take her to that specialist on Tuesday, she would never walk out a free woman again. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open below, and the faint rhythmic hiss of the gas line began to waft through the vents. Julian wasn't waiting for Tuesday anymore. He was looking for a spark to finish the job tonight. The silence of a house at 3 a.m. is never truly creaks, but tonight, a new sound invaded the shadows, a faint rhythmic hiss coming from the vents. It was a sound that made the hair on Elena's arms stand up as she sat on the edge of the guest bed. Listening to the heavy thud of Julian's footsteps in the basement below, she realized the stakes had shifted from her sanity to her very survival. He wasn't waiting for a doctor's signature on Tuesday anymore. He was waiting for a spark. Elena grabbed her father's old, heavy brass letter opener from the nightstand, its cold weight a reminder of the dignity she was fighting to reclaim. She crept into the hallway, moving only when the house groaned to mask her footsteps. Reaching the top of the basement stairs, she saw a sliver of light spilling through the door and heard a woman's voice. "Is it done?" Chloe whispered, her greed almost audible through the wood. Julian replied with clinical detachment, "I've loosened the coupling on the water heater line. One spark from the pilot light when it kicks on in 20 minutes, and this whole place goes up." Elena felt a wave of rage so hot it threatened to choke her, but she held her breath, watching them through the crack in the door. They were standing over her father's cedar chest, pulling out velvet bags of jewelry and a leather-bound ledger Julian didn't know existed until now. Julian's eyes widened as he realized the international deeds inside were worth 10 times what he had anticipated. "We can't let her just die in a fire," Chloe hissed, her face transforming into a mask of pure avarice. "We need her alive long enough to sign these transfers, or the money stays in probate for years." As they moved toward the stairs, Elena sprinted to the kitchen, grabbing a wet dishcloth to tie over her face as the smell of gas grew stronger. She ducked into the pantry just as Julian entered the kitchen, his voice returning to that sickly sweet, concerned husband tone. While he searched for her upstairs, Elena slipped out of the pantry and headed directly for the basement, the last place they would expect her to go. She found the water heater, grabbed the wrench Julian had left on the floor, and threw her entire weight into it. Clank! The metal groaned and the hissing stopped, but Elena wasn't finished. She realized then that this was a professional syndicate, a predatory team that had likely done this to others before. Just as she reached for the latch of a small crawl space window to escape, a hand grabbed her ankle with terrifying force. "Gotcha," Julian sneered, pinning her to the concrete floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh syringe, his face a mask of pure malice. "You think you're so smart, Elena? This one is fast acting. You'll be conscious enough to move your hand for a pen, but you won't be able to say a single word." Julian's weight was a suffocating pressure against Elena's chest, his clinical detachment replaced by a jagged, desperate fury as he pinned her to the cold concrete. "Swapping the protein shakes, Elena? Did you really think I wouldn't notice eventually?" he sneered, the tip of the needle glinting under the lone basement bulb. He wasn't just a surgeon anymore. He was a predator who had finally cornered his prey, his face twisted into a mask of pure malice that stripped away years of practiced charm. He pressed the syringe against her arm, whispering that she would be conscious enough to move her hand for the signatures. But her voice, the truth he had spent years trying to drown, would be gone forever. Elena looked up at him, her vision blurring from the hit to her head, but she didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, hard certainty. "Look at the water heater, Julian," she whispered, her voice raspy but steady. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the wrench she had used to tighten the line. But more importantly, he saw the pressure release valve she had rigged with her father's heavy brass letter opener. The heater began to vibrate with a low guttural growl, a mechanical beast pushed to its absolute limit. "I forensic accounted your plan," she said with a bloody, triumphant smile, "and the math doesn't look good for you." Suddenly, the front door was kicked in, the sound of heavy boots thundering through the house as the police arrived, led by Detective Miller. They flooded the basement just as Julian's thumb moved toward the plunger, forcing him to drop the syringe as they dragged him off her. Elena lay on the floor, breathing in the scent of damp concrete and the dying hiss of gas, realizing that the architecture of silence Julian had built was finally crumbling. He was led away in cuffs, but as the blue light strobed against the falling snow, he screamed back that it didn't matter. Chloe and my mother have the ledger, Elena. They're already halfway to the private airfield. Elena sat on the back of the ambulance, a shock blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching Julian being pushed into the cruiser. She didn't say a word as she reached into her pocket and felt the cold, jagged edge of the brass letter opener. She looked at Detective Miller, who appeared frustrated that the main accomplices were vanishing with her father's global empire. "Let them go, Detective," Elena said, her voice reclaiming its power for the first time in 4 years. "They didn't steal a fortune, they just stole a death sentence." Julian thought he had won the war, but he forgot one thing. A vault built by a master only opens for the worthy. He had no idea that the ledger they were clutching was a honeypot, a self-triggering legal trap that was about to turn their flight into a cage. 6 months had passed since the snow-covered night the basement almost became Elena's tomb. The world looked different now, colored by the soft greens of early summer rather than the clinical white Julian had preferred. Elena sat on her own porch, the one Julian had tried to sell out from under her, holding a cup of tea that she didn't have to swap. There were no blue vials hidden in gym bags and no secret cameras in the smoke detectors. Across from her sat Mrs. Gable, the woman who had lived 18 years of silence, so Elena wouldn't have to. They didn't need many words. The rhythmic creak of the porch swing was a shared language of survival. The physical bruise on Elena's face was long gone, but the internal healing had been a much slower reconstruction. She was back in her career as a forensic accountant, but she wasn't just balancing corporate books anymore. Her internal ledger was finally clear. Reclaiming her name and her dignity meant learning to take up space in the world without shrinking for a man's comfort. Julian was serving his sentence, his clinical mask permanently stripped away by the evidence Elena had gathered with Elias. He had tried to treat her like a business transaction to be liquidated, but he had underestimated the strength of a woman who knows the math of her own worth. The doorbell rang, and Elena found her mother standing there, clutching a designer purse that suddenly looked like a heavy, useless shield. For months, the silence between them had been a cold wall. "I'm so sorry, Elena," her mother whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I wanted the prestige of a son-in-law like him so badly that I chose his reputation over your safety. I ignored the signs because I didn't want the scandal." Elena looked at the woman who had birthed her and felt a strange, quiet empathy, but also a firm sense of self-respect. She didn't let her inside. Rebuilding her life required healthy boundaries, and that meant realizing that some apologies are meant for the past, not the future. Elena used the substantial settlement from the divorce and the recovered assets from Julian's offshore accounts to fund a local legal aid clinic. She called it the Gable Foundation. It was a place for victims of domestic violence to find more than just safety. It was where they could find the forensic and legal tools to fight back before the fog became permanent. She knew now that truth doesn't always need a loud voice to win. Sometimes it just needs one person with the courage to record the first lie. The afternoon sun warmed Elena's face as she watched Mrs. Gable walk back to her house across the street. This was what recovery felt like, the steady beat of a heart that no longer hammers in fear. Betrayal had been a storm, but justice was the quiet that followed. She took a sip of her tea and felt the weight of her own history, not as a burden, but as the foundation for the woman she had become. She was finally free not just from Julian, but from the person he had convinced her she was. Thank you for following Elena's journey from the shadows into the light. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, please leave a comment below to let us know. We have more stories of resilience and justice coming soon, and we would love to have you with us for the next one.